Marigold's eyes darted to the ridge beyond the dust trail, searching for the source of that shot. The silence that followed felt too heavy. The riders frozen as if the wind itself had turned to stone around them. She felt the kick of adrenaline pulsing through her veins. That shot hadn't come from her rifle. And by the look on the lead rider's face, it hadn't come from any of his men either. Midnight shifted beneath her, sensing the change before Marigold did. She kept the repeater leveled on the gang's leader, whose hand hovered near his revolver, but didn't dare finish the draw. "You got a guardian angel out here, Widow Sinclair." The leader sneered, though his voice cracked around the edges. His eyes swept the ridgeline behind her. He didn't see what she saw, the shadow slipping through the sagebrush, moving like smoke, so fluid that it was gone the second her mind caught up with her eyes. She didn't answer him. Instead, she drew a slow, deep breath, centering herself. The way Henry once taught her when storms rattled the roof. "You can't control the wind," he'd say, "but you can lean into it." The youngest of the riders, a wiry boy with sunburned cheeks, swallowed hard and shifted in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we oughta—" "Shut it, Jeb." The leader barked, but his eyes betrayed him, flicking nervously back to the hills. He knew the sound of a marksman's warning shot when he heard it. And this one had come so close, it was meant to part the hair on his head. Marigold pressed her knees to Midnight's flanks, guiding the Mari to pivot sideways so she could watch both the riders and the open plain behind her cabin. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, but her voice came out steady. "You got what you came for last time," she said, the words tasting like iron. "You burned my barn, took my feed. There's nothing left for you here but lead." A murmur rippled through the men, nervous glances traded like cards in a rigged game. One rider nudged his horse forward, a big man with a scar across his cheek and dead eyes that seemed to pin her in place. "Reckon we see about that ourselves. You stand aside, we'll poke around nice and polite." The windmill moaned. Again, a warning creak that crawled down Marigold's spine. Her hand tightened on the rifle's stock. "You put one boot past that fence and you'll see just how polite I can be." A dry chuckle rose from behind the leader's scarf. "That so? Lady, you ain't got but one round in that piece. You think you're gonna hold us all off with that belly in your way?" His grin didn't reach his eyes. And she knew, deep in her bones, that if he saw even a hint of fear, he'd push harder, tear down what little she had left. So she did what her father had taught her. She didn't blink, didn't breathe too fast, didn't flinch. And then the wind shifted, carrying the smell of horses, sweat, and the faint whiff of gun oil. A figure emerged at the edge of the ridge. Tall, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His silhouette cut against the rising sun, a phantom out of old stories. The leader twisted in his saddle to look, and his horse shied beneath him. The newcomer didn't speak, didn't raise his rifle. He simply rested one hand on the revolver at his hip and leaned into his stance. Weight settled like he'd rooted himself in the dirt. Jeb, the wiry boy, went pale. "Hush!" The leader snapped. But the rest of the gang had seen it now. The way the stranger stood, calm as death in a graveyard. A legend that had once been whispered around campfires and saloons. A name that had vanished like smoke, buried in rumor and dust. Marigold felt a strange twist in her gut. Fear and relief braided together so tight, she thought she might choke on it. She kept her rifle steady. "You know this man?" she asked the leader, her voice soft but carrying. The leader spat again, but his hand trembled. "Ain't no man, just stories, old ghost." But the way the outlaw shifted in his saddle told her everything. Ghost or not, something about that figure had turned the balance of this standoff on its head. The stranger spoke at last, his voice drifting across the distance like the first roll of thunder before a storm. "Leave your horses, leave your guns. Walk back to whatever snake pit you slithered from." The leader forced a sneer, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. "You alone, Shadow? You think you can drop us all before we draw?" "Shadow." Marigold's breath caught in her throat. That name was old, so old it had become legend. The Prairie Shadow. The deadliest shot to ever ride this stretch of nowhere. Some said he'd died at Deadwood. Others whispered he'd just traded his gun for a bottle and faded like a ghost into the plains. The man shifted slightly. His coat flapped in the wind, revealing the butt of his revolver, worn smooth by use, yet polished to a dull gleam. "Test me," he said. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The windmill groaned. The horses stamped nervously. A bird cawed from somewhere overhead, startled by the tension humming in the earth. Then the leader snarled. "Get him!" It was over before Marigold could blink. The stranger didn't draw so much as his gun appeared in his hand, muzzle flashing twice, 3 times. Riders screamed, falling from their saddles like ragdolls. Hooves pounded the earth. As the horses scattered in a panic, one outlaw fired blindly before toppling backward. A clean hole punched through the brim of his hat. When the smoke cleared, only the leader and the boy Jeb remained, frozen in place. The stranger took a step forward. His shadow stretched across the parched grass like a noose. "Run," he said. Jeb dropped his gun so fast it thudded into the dust. He wheeled his horse and vanished into the trees. The leader stayed a heartbeat longer, eyes darting between Marigold and the figure at the ridge, as if he couldn't decide which was more dangerous. Then he spat again, turned, and rode after. The boy. Silence settled like ash. Marigold's arms lowered at last, her rifle suddenly heavy. The stranger holstered his revolver and watched the retreating figures until they were nothing but dust ghosts. Then, slowly, he looked at her dot before. She could speak, her legs buckled. Midnight whinnied in alarm, shifting under her weight. The last thing she saw was the stranger striding forward, his silhouette blotting out the burning sun. The windmill turned one more time, its creak like an old hymn as Marigold slipped into darkness. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Marigold's vision swam as she slipped into darkness, the wind's keening song the last thing her consciousness heard. Pain unfurled behind her eyelids, sharp, insistent, but even that receded, replaced by the soft weight of the prairie shadows. Hand at her back, she lay sprawled in the dust beside Midnight's trembling hooves, the mare's flanks heaving like storm clouds. A moment ago, the world had erupted in gunfire. Now everything felt unnaturally still. "Easy," the stranger murmured, voice low as the earth beneath them. He eased her to one side, careful as a surgeon. Marigold blinked, trying to clear the stars dancing against her lids. Her hand rose instinctively to her side, and at that moment, a distant rumble echoed across the plain, a reminder that time moved even if wounds could stall it. The prairie shadow's gaze flicked to the ridge, muscles tensing as he scanned for threats. Marigold tried to shift, to sit up, but the world tilted. Above her, the sky burned with midday sun, but the heat felt distant, as if she watched it through a haze. She swallowed, clearing her throat. "Where am I?" She whispered, voice raw. "On your property," he answered. He knelt beside her, brushing hair from her forehead. His hand was gentle but strong. Safe for now. Her breath hitched, fear and relief colliding. "You saved me." He hesitated, eyes shadowed. "You saved yourself." She tried to focus on his face, but it remained half-shrouded in shadow. His wide-brimmed hat cast his features into obscurity. Only his eyes caught the light steel gray, glinting with purpose. "Who are you?" she asked, but the question felt inadequate. She knew who he was, the rumors, the tales spun in saloons and around campfires. The man who had once been the most feared shooter in 2 territories, whose speed and precision had become legend. The Prairie Shadow. His name had left scars on every gang that dared cross the plains. Now it lay quietly beside her cradle, folded away beneath a mother's quilt. Yet here he was, back in the world, drawn to her like a breath to a flame. Offered his hand. "You're hurt." She tried to laugh but coughed instead. "You're not. Old scars." She accepted his help and rose to her knees. The pain lanced through her side, but she refused to stay down. She leaned on him, needing something real, something solid. He steadied her, concern flickering across his hidden face. "They'll regroup," she said, voice gritty. She spat handfuls of dust. "They'll come back with fresh horses." He nodded as if he'd been waiting for her to say it. Behind them, the ramshackle walls of the cabin stood bruised by gunfire. Splinters of shattered wood lay scattered like fallen teeth. Yet within those walls lay her future, the cradle, the quilt, the unborn child she carried. "Let's make sure." "They don't," he said. She widened her stance, planting her boots in the dust. Her dress was torn, blood seeping beneath the fabric, but her eyes shone with iron will. "Teach me," she said. His gaze softened with something like admiration. "First, you rest." She blinked at him, incredulous. "Rest?" He gestured to the cabin door. "There's water inside." "I'll tend to that wound." She considered arguing, but the pain was too real, too insistent. Nodding, she allowed him to guide her toward the cabin. Inside, the air was stale. As old socks, but clean enough. A hand-hewn table bore a chipped tin basin half filled with water, and a rag lay beside it. Marigold sank onto a chair as he disappeared into the shadows. Larkin was already there, leaning against the wall, eyes wide with awe. "By the Lord," he whispered. Marigold managed a crooked smile. "He's real." Larkin nodded, but his eyes were on the door, braced for more trouble. The windmill's groans seeped through the wooden shutters, a reminder that time was scarce. The prairie shadow returned with water and a cloth. He knelt before her, tilting the basin so the light caught the tarnish on its rim. "Clear?" "He?" asked. She lifted the rag, exposing the wound. A neat bullet hole grazed her side, the edges darkened with dried blood. She stifled a gasp as he gently dabbed at it, cleaning the wound. "Painful," she muttered. "Not fatal." His voice was calm, practiced. He pressed a clean cloth to the cut. "You'll live." She closed her eyes, letting the sting wash through her. When she opened them, she saw it, a fierce protectiveness in his stance, as if her life had become his purpose in that moment. He wrapped a fresh bandage, his fingers moving deftly, betraying years of practice. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "They'll test you again." She lifted her head, resolve crystallizing. "Then I'll be ready." He paused, looking into her fierce eyes. "Teach you," he murmured. "But first, you'll need to understand why I returned." Marigold swallowed. "Why?" His gaze drifted to the broken window, to the rolling plain beyond. "Because someone needed to remind this land that mercy can be as deadly as vengeance." Her heart thundered. "Me?" He turned back to her, though the light kept his face half hidden. "You." And in that moment, a silent alliance formed between them. A pregnant widow and a legendary gunman, bound by blood and bullets. Outside, the windmill spun its eerie dirge, impatience stirring the plains. The next storm was coming, and with it, the reckoning. With Marigold on her feet and the prairie shadow at her side, the homestead would see its darkest night yet. But now, she had a mentor, a guardian, and a fierce new purpose. The sun dipped low over the Sinclair homestead, stretching shadows long across the beaten earth. Marigold stood at the doorway of her cabin, her silhouette framed by the fading glow. Inside, the walls still smelled faintly of gunpowder and sage. Her wound pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a constant reminder of how close death had come, and how close it would come again. She felt the boards creak behind her as the prairie shadow stepped inside. He moved without sound, his boots barely, whispering against the floor. Even in the gathering dusk, his presence filled the small space like a second frontier wind, sharp, cold, but somehow necessary. "You should be resting," he said, his voice that familiar low rumble. He didn't chide her. He simply stated the truth, letting it settle between them. Marigold pressed a hand to her side, ignoring the throb beneath the bandage. "No rest while they're still out there," she said. Her eyes drifted past him, to where her old hunting rifle leaned near the hearth. It looked more like a relic than a weapon now, a relic like her. Or like him. The prairie shadow followed her gaze. "That gun's more honest than most men I've known," he said. "But you'll need more than iron and grit." She turned to face him, lifting her chin. "So teach me." The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of what might have been a smile. "Tomorrow. Tonight we watch." She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. He was right. The dust the riders kicked up at dawn could be the last warning they'd get. She needed to be ready to hold the line, and for that, she needed to keep her eyes open. They moved together, silent as ghosts. Out. On the porch, the windmill groaned overhead. Larkin sat on the steps, cleaning what was left of his revolver. He looked up as they joined him, his face pale in the twilight. "I fixed the latch on the south fence," he said, voice rough from a day spent hammering boards into place. "Won't hold much if they come with fire." The prairie shadow nodded. "Then we'll meet them before they reach the fence." Marigold lowered herself beside Larkin, the wooden step cool against her spine. She felt the baby shift inside her, small but insistent, a living promise that she would see tomorrow's sunrise. No matter the odds. The shadow leaned against the post, one hand resting near his holstered Colt. He scanned the horizon as the last band of gold slipped behind the hills. Silence settled, in one of those silences that holds every sound hostage until the next breath breaks it. "They'll come tonight," Marigold said. It wasn't a question. "They're opportunists," the shadow replied. "Cowards. Men that fear the dark because it hides the righteous." She let that settle, tasting its truth. She had known cowards before, drifters who'd break a man's back for a bottle of whiskey and a scrap of bread. But the men who'd come for her now were something else. This was no drunken brawl or petty theft. This was retribution, merciless, methodical, hungry. Larkin cleared his throat. "You really him?" he asked, voice cracking. The prairie shadow. The stranger didn't answer at first. He shifted, letting the wind catch his coat. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called out a lonely, mournful sound. "I was," he said at last. "Now I'm just a man with old regrets." Marigold's eyes caught the glint of his revolver in the moonlight. "And yet you're here." He looked at her then, and she saw it for the first time, the sorrow behind that steel. The weight of every shot fired, every name carved into memory. Legends don't grow old because they can't, but this one had. And somehow that made him more dangerous. "They'll come for your land," he said. "But what they're really coming for is your fear. They want to see you break before the bullet comes." She swallowed, throat tight. "Then they chose the wrong woman." He studied her face for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Good." The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of distant smoke. Larkin stiffened. "Fire? Campfire," the shadow said. He lifted his chin toward the distant ridge. "They're close, hungry, stupid enough to think a fire won't give them away." Marigold stood, the ache in her side a cold reminder. "We strike first?" The shadow shook his head. "No, we let them think they've got the upper hand. Fear is a weapon, but so is hope. Let him cling to it for a while." She felt the truth of it settle deep in her bones. Every inch of the prairie had taught her patience, waiting for rain, waiting for dawn, waiting for the coyotes to show their eyes at the edge of the chicken coop. And now she would wait for these men too. She turned to go inside but stopped when she felt his hand on her shoulder. Not heavy, not possessive, just there. A silent vow. "You're stronger than you know," he said. She held his gaze, searching for a lie. She found none. Inside, she laid her rifle near the window and sank onto the edge of the bed. The cradle sat beside her, its tiny blanket folded neat. She brushed her fingertips along its edge, feeling the rough grain of the wood Henry had carved. Before his last ride in that moment, she swore to herself, this child would be born free. No man would ever take that promise away from her. Outside, the prairie shadow stood sentinel in the dark. He watched the faint glow on the ridge flicker and die, and his hand never once strayed from his holster. The night would be long, and before dawn, blood would stain this land again, but not hers, not tonight. The first light of dawn bled across the horizon like a wound, pale and raw. Marigold stood behind the crumbling stone wall that edged the Sinclair claim, rifle in hand, the weight of new purpose steady in her arms. Beside her, the prairie shadow crouched, eyes narrowed against the rising sun. They watched the ridge where the outlaws had camped, now silent but for the crackle of the dying fire. Her breath misted in the cool air, and for a moment the world seemed as still as the grave. She felt the baby shift inside her, a reminder of why she fought, a promise of life against the specter of death. The shadow's whisper cut through her reverie. "They'll break here." He pointed to a gap in the fence where the boards had splintered under the weight of horses. She followed his gaze. A crude breach, barely enough for a man to slip through, but wide enough for a gang to swarm. "Then we funnel them," he said. His gloved hand traced a line along the fence that led to a narrow alley of stacked feed sacks, creating a corridor in the open plain. "They'll think they have cover, but it only buys us distance to pick targets." She nodded, heart pounding. He had taught her patience. Now he taught her tactics, how to shape the battlefield, turning her homestead into a choke point. Beyond the feed sacks, the cabin's rickety porch offered concealment for her close shot. Beyond that, the orchards. Thin-leaved trees hid the final fallback point. She glanced at him. "My house." He met her gaze with an intensity that made her pulse race. "They'll come for it, but we won't let them have it." Distant hoofbeats rose from the ridge. A thunderous heartbeat, announcing the outlaws' advance. Marigold braced herself, shoulders squared. The shadow knelt to her ear. "Remember your training. Wait for the moment." She inhaled, calming the tremor in her hands. The first rider tore through the broken fence, spurting splinters, and thundered toward the feed sack corridor. She held her fire, letting him vanish behind the first barrier before squeezing the trigger. The shot cracked like a shotgun blast, and the outlaw pitched off his horse in a spray of dust. The next man reined in, terror flickering in his eyes as he saw his comrade fall. He lodged his horse into the makeshift corridor, guns swinging. Marigold tracked him, heart hammering. She aimed at the space between the feed sacks, trusting her instinct. Another shot, and the man's hat spun through the air. He veered wildly, trampling the sacks as he stumbled away. A chorus of shouts rose from the pack. The outlaws flanked the corridor, trying to approach from both sides. The shadow's voice reached her again. "Shift left. Hold." She pivoted, retracing her stance to line up on a second rider who peeked around the barrier. He froze at the sight of her calm face and steadied rifle. She let him linger. Then, when his horse's flanks brushed against her feed sack wall, she fired. The rider yelped and collapsed backward, horse veering off the path. The gang's formation cracked. Horses reared, riders cursed and fired blindly into the corridor. Bullets spit into the sky, kicking up dirt at her boots. The shadow moved behind her, rifle at his shoulder, his stance confident, deadly. He picked off a man who tried to skirt the barrier, voice flat as he countered his shots in his head. Marigold's breaths came ragged now, but she kept firing, conserving rounds, aiming for limbs and shoulders to slow them. Her training with the shadow paid off, each shot precise, calculated. Suddenly, a rider burst from the far side, charging the cabin's porch. Marigold recognized Clay Redmond, the leader who'd threatened her life the week before. Anger and Fear coiled inside her, burning hotter than any bullet. He dismounted with a roar, revolver in hand. "Thought you'd hide behind walls, widow," he snarled. Marigold steadied her aim, selecting her moment. She squeezed the trigger, but nothing happened. An empty chamber. Panic flared. Redmond's grin widened as he advanced, but before he could draw closer, a deafening blast roared behind him. The Shadow's shotgun thundered, knocking Redmond off his feet and sending him sprawling among the feed sacks. Marigold pivoted, heart slamming against her ribs. He reached her side in 2 strides, eyes blazing. "Reload!" he commanded. Hands shaking, Marigold swapped magazines and rammed home fresh rounds. She tried to calm her pulse by focusing on the rifle's sight. The remaining outlaws, now reduced to 4, regrouped beyond the orchard's edge, weapons raised. Marigold swallowed fear, sighting on the nearest man. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang true, catching his shoulder and sending him tumbling. Behind a tree. Another shot, and the next outlaw crumpled, the shock of her rifle sending him reeling through the orchard rows. Only 2 remained. One crouched behind a tree, and Clay Redmond, bloodied but alive, dragged himself upright. The Shadow's ghostly silhouette moved to cut off Redmond's escape, leaving Marigold to face the last man. The outlaw leveled his pistol at her, hatred twisting his face. Marigold stood her ground, chin high. "It's over," she intoned. Voice echoing across the orchard. He squeezed the trigger, and a bullet whizzed past her face, tearing through the wooden porch railing. Splinters flew, the echo sharper than thunder. She dove to the side, rifle crashing against her shoulder. The Shadow's voice boomed. "Down, under the porch." They tumbled together beneath the boards, bullets peppering the wood overhead. Marigold's heart rattled in her chest as the outlaw's shots drilled the porch supports. In the narrow darkness, the Shadow pressed his body against hers. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. His words were a lifeline in the chaos. Marigold nodded, swallowing hard as she loaded the final shell. Redmond's voice rang from above, triumphant. "I lend you both." A single beam of light broke through the floorboards as the last outlaw stepped onto the porch. Marigold braced herself, finger tightening on the trigger. Before her panic could take hold, a sharp crack sounded. The outlaw's pistol flew from his hand, shattered by the Shadow's rifle. He turned, eyes wide, but never saw the widow's rifle muzzle rising to meet him. A single shot killed him cleanly, echoing through the orchard like a funeral bell. Silence followed, thick and heavy. When Marigold emerged from beneath the porch, the field lay littered with the fallen. 4 outlaws, 2 mortally wounded, all subdued. Clay Redmond lay pinned beneath the shattered feed sacks, blood soaking the earth. Marigold stood tall, rifle at her side. The Shadow appeared behind her, hands raised in a gesture of surrender to the morning's quiet. Marigold inhaled, the weight of what she'd done settling like dawn dew on her shoulders. She looked at him, eyes bright with tears and triumph. "We did it." He met her gaze, a flicker of respect in his gray eyes. "You did." Beyond the orchard, the sun rose fully, burning away the last shadows of night. The homestead stood battered, but unbroken, and so did she, a widow no more but a defender of life. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the broken fence line long after the last shot faded. The windmill turned lazily in the breeze, its creak oddly reassuring as Marigold stood among the fallen. Boots sunk deep in churned soil and trampled grass. Her rifle felt heavier than ever now that the danger had passed, or so it seemed. She could still hear the prairie Shadow's voice echoing in her head. "Don't trust the quiet. The quiet always hides something." She pushed a strand of hair from her eyes. A bead of sweat traced her temple, mingling with the dirt and blood spattered on her cheek. She forced herself to look at the bodies, Clay Redmond among them, eyes glassy with the same disbelief he'd worn when he fell. His death should have felt like closure, but instead it felt like a door kicked open to darker places. A cough from behind snapped her back to the present. The prairie shadow stepped from the orchard's edge, revolver still in hand. His coat was torn at the shoulder, a thin line of blood showing where a bullet had grazed him. He ignored it, eyes sweeping the horizon. "More?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He didn't answer right away. He knelt beside Redmond's body, prying a folded scrap of paper from the outlaw's vest. He opened it, brow furrowing. Then he handed it to her. "Read." She unfolded it, hands trembling. The paper was yellowed, smudged with sweat and dirt. A rough map sketched in charcoal showed her land, a crude X over the cabin. Beneath it, "Hold the Sinclair woman until Wade arrives." Marigold's chest constricted. "Wade," she said, tasting the name like poison. She'd heard it whispered in passing before. Wade Hawkins, the half-brother of a raider Henry once tangled with up in Deadwood. A man known for crossing borders and breaking truces like twigs. "They weren't here to rob you," the prairie shadow said. "They were here to keep you busy. The real threat's still coming." A bitter laugh bubbled from her throat, then died. "How many?" "Hard to say." He tucked the map into his coat, glancing toward the far ridge where the dust of Redmond's men had settled. "Wade rides with scavengers, guns for hire, men who get drunk on fear." She braced herself against the fence post. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. The wound in her side throbbed like a second heartbeat. But beneath the pain, a coal of anger glowed hot. "We fight," she said. The prairie shadow tilted his head. "You'll need more than grit. You'll need the town." Marigold barked out a laugh that held no humor. "That town turned its back on me the day Henry was buried. They won't come." He stepped closer, voice low but cutting. "Then make them. Show them what they stand to lose when Wade rides through here, unchecked." She looked up at him, really seeing him now. The lines around his eyes, the weariness in his bones that no legend could hide. Yet his hands were steady, his gaze unwavering. "How?" she asked. He reached into his coat, pulling out a battered tin star, the deputy's badge he'd once carried when the prairie shadow was just a kid named Nathan under Marshal Bob's wing. He pressed it into her palm. "You've got more right to wear this than most of them," he said. "Show them you're not asking for help, you're giving them a chance to stand for themselves." She stared at the star, its edges dulled, but still catching the morning light. The cold metal seemed to burn into her skin. Larkin emerged from behind the cabin, breathless and wide-eyed. He looked from the bodies to the badge in her hand. "More coming?" Marigold nodded. "Wade Hawkins." Larkin swore under his breath, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Folks in town'll bolt the second they hear that name." "Not if they see him for what he is," the shadow said. He turned, scanning the distant trail that wound toward Whisper Valley. "You ride into town at midday. Take the badge. Take the truth. And show them how close they are to losing everything they've built." Marigold's mouth went dry. She felt her baby shift again, the tiny flutter of life that made her stand a little taller, even when her body screamed to lie. "Down. And you?" she asked. "I'll buy you time." The shadow holstered his revolver, stepping past the corpses toward the ridge. "Wade's men are tracking. They'll find me first. I'll bleed them, scatter them, slow them down." She reached for his arm. "You can't hold them off alone." He looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes. There was that flicker of the young man who'd once stood on a dusty street in Deadwood, too fast for his own good, but too tired to run anymore. "I've been alone for a long time," he said. "This time, I'm not." Their eyes locked, and in that heartbeat she understood. The prairie shadow hadn't returned just to save her. He'd come back to remember what it was to fight for something worth dying for. She pressed the star to her chest, feeling its weight settle against her heartbeat. "Come back to us," she said. He gave a ghost of a smile. Only if you make the town believe." Then he was gone, striding up the ridge without a backward glance, coat flapping. Like a banner of defiance, Marigold watched him vanish into the wavering heat. Larkin stepped to her side, voice small. "You really gonna go back there?" She closed her fingers around the badge. "They'll hear me this time." And as the sun climbed higher, the windmill turned overhead, creaking a slow, steady hymn. Not of surrender, but of a widow who decided to stand alone or not, until the last star in the sky went dark. The dusty road to Whisper Valley stretched ahead like a scar across the land. Marigold guided Midnight down its rutted path, the deputy's star pinned to her collar, catching the relentless sun. Each hoofbeat thudded through her ribs, echoing. In the pit of her stomach where her child turned restlessly, as if sensing the storm brewing on the horizon, the prairie shadow's words, repeated in her head, "Show them what they stand to lose." She crested the last rise. And there it lay, the town that had turned its back on her after Henry's coffin dropped into the frozen ground. The same town that had whispered when her belly rounded, "Too soon for some folks' taste." The same town that pretended not to see her hauling barrels and hammering nails alone while they traded gossip in the Silver Star Saloon. Now they would have to see her. They'd have no choice. Mid-morning heat rose in shimmering waves as she rode down the main street. Shopkeepers paused, halfway through sweeping doorsteps or haggling prices. Eyes narrowed behind lace curtains. A few men straightened from barrels they'd been leaning on, mouths twitching with questions they didn't dare speak. Marigold reined in at the wide planked porch of the Silver Star. Its sign creaked overhead, faded letters dancing in the breeze. She could almost see Nate Hawkins, the prairie shadow, standing behind that bar once, watching this same street with eyes that missed nothing. She swung down from Midnight's saddle, boots landing hard. She felt the pull in her side where the wound still healed, but she stood tall, back straight, rifle slung across her shoulder. When she stepped through the bat-wing doors, every conversation inside died like a candle snuffed by wind. The saloon was half full, ranch hands. Traders, the sheriff's lone deputy leaning at the end of the bar, scratching dried mud from his boots. All eyes turned to her. Some widened at the sight of the star pinned to her chest. Marigold let the silence stretch. She wanted them to feel the weight she carried. "Clay Redmond is dead," she said, her voice carrying clear through the stale air. "And the men he brought to burn me out are dead too." A murmur rippled through the room. The deputy straightened, his boots dropping to the floor with a thud. She scanned their faces, men who'd once looked at her with pity or suspicion. But that wasn't the end. "Wade Hawkins is coming. He means to finish what Clay started. And he'll ride through this town like a prairie fire if you let him." The deputy barked a dry laugh. "You think Wade Hawkins cares about your farm? That's a family feud, Widow Sinclair. Best you ride on and let the men handle it." Marigold stepped closer, her boots echoing off the floorboards. She could see her reflection in the mirror behind the bar, hair windblown, cheeks raw from sun and sweat, but her eyes were alive, unbowed. "This isn't just about me," she said, voice steady as iron. "When Wade finds my farm burned and empty, do you think he'll ride back north? No, he'll come here, take your cattle, your children, whatever makes it worth the ride." A rancher near the poker table shifted uncomfortably. "Wade's just a name," he muttered. Marigold unpinned the badge, holding it up so they could all see. This was Nate Hawkins' star once. The prairie shadows. "He gave it to me because he knows I'll fight when no one else will. But one woman and one man won't be enough this time." She drew in a breath, letting the memories of her burned barn, her blood-soaked soil, the cradle waiting at home pour into her voice. "If you want to keep pretending you're safe, do it. Bolt your doors, pray Wade rides past. But when you hear the screams at your neighbor's fence line, remember you chose this." Silence again. No one dared meet her gaze. then an old man. At the bar, Walt Jenkins, whose debts she'd quietly covered more than once, cleared his throat. "What you want us to do, girl?" Marigold felt her hands tighten around the badge. "I want you to stand. I want every able-bodied man to ride to my farm before nightfall. We build barricades, dig trenches. The women and children, we get them to the church cellar, and we stand, together." Walt nodded slowly. "Ain't had cause to stand in a long while," the deputy scoffed. "This is suicide." Walt turned to him, eyes narrowed. "So's dying in your sleep with your throat slit. I'd rather die holding a gun." A murmur of agreement rose, small at first, then growing as ranch hands exchanged looks, hard men who knew what waited for them if they did nothing. Marigold saw it spark, the fragile tinder of courage catching its last dot. She pinned the star back to her chest. "We can do this," she said. "But not if we keep our heads in the sand. Wade Hawkins rides tonight. We ride back now." A young rancher stood up, knocking his chair backward. "I'll get my brothers. We got rifles ammo." Another man slapped the bar. "Got dynamite left from the river dredge." Hope bloomed in her chest, sharp and desperate, but real. She looked at Walt, who tipped his hat with a ghost of a grin. "Guess the prairie shadow was right about you, widow. Some legends don't stay buried." She touched the cradle of her belly as the saloon erupted in hurried orders, boots pounding the floor, men rushing for the door. The deputy lingered by the bar, jaw tight. "If we survive this, folks will remember your name." She stared him down, her voice soft but carrying. "Don't remember my name. Remember what it took to stand when it would have been easier to run." Outside, the wind kicked up dust devils along the street. Horses were saddled. Guns were checked. Men who had once judged her now looked at her with the respect born of fear and resolve. Marigold mounted midnight again, the badge pinned to her breast, the town riding behind her like a THUNDERCLOUD as they left the main street. She cast one last glance over her shoulder, not to see who followed, but to remind herself what they left behind, a place that would stand or burn as one. She whispered to her unborn child, low enough for only the wind to hear, "Hold on, just a little longer." And as the column rode out of Whisper Valley, the horizon shimmered with the promise of a coming storm. The ride back to the homestead was a thunder of hoofbeats and held breath. Marigold led them at the head of the ragged column, ranch hands, old trappers, boys barely old enough to shave, all of them rattling down the dusty trail like the echo of a forgotten army. Behind her, Walt Jenkins kept pace despite his age, his old shotgun strapped across his back. To her left, young Tom Greeley checked his father's long rifle for the 5th time in as many miles. They looked to her now, not just as a widow or a burden, but as something more, the thin line between the living and the hungry dark. The wind carried the scent of turned earth and distant smoke. It tangled in her hair as she pressed midnight harder, her hand at the star on her breast. Every bump in the road jarred her wound, the pain stitching bright sparks at the edge of her vision, but she stayed upright. She could not falter now. When the roof of her cabin came into view, her breath caught. From this distance it looked like nothing more than a huddle of gray boards and splintered shingles, but to her, it was fortress and cradle, tomb and hope. A place worth bleeding for. The prairie shadow was waiting. He stepped from the orchard's edge as they approached, his coat flapping like a tattered flag in the gusting wind. His eyes flicked over the men and boys behind her, reading their fear and their thin threads of courage. "They came," he said, voice low, more statement than surprise. Marigold swung down from midnight, boots thumping against the churned earth. She stood before him, sweat streaking the grime on her face, the badge glinting like a second sun. "They know what happens if they don't." He studied her for a heartbeat, the rifle on her shoulder, the squared set of her jaw, and nodded once. "Good, that gives us a chance." The men began to dismount, some already peeling off to haul boards from wagons, others dumping sacks of dry grain to bolster the barricades. The air buzzed with hammer blows and muttered curses. A handful of mothers and wives led the children toward the root cellar behind the barn, their faces pale but eyes sharp. They understood too well what would come if the walls fell. Walt limped up, leaning on his shotgun like a cane. "Where you want us?" he asked the shadow, voice rasping. The shadow pointed toward the fence line where the feed sack corridor had once turned Redmond's gang into easy targets. "Build the barricade there. Use the wagons and crates. Force them to come through the open field." He turned to Marigold. "Take half the men and watch the south ridge. Wade's smart. He'll circle, test your flanks. Don't let him." She stiffened at the word test. She'd heard it enough in her father's voice when he spoke of outlaws, the way they'd poke and prod until they found the softest flesh to sink their knives. She squeezed his forearm once before she moved, her fingers brushing the frayed edge of his sleeve. He didn't flinch, but he didn't linger either. Already he was turning, barking orders at men who obeyed without question. The legend had returned, and in his wake, fear found no place to root. By dusk the land bristled with rough barricades and trenches. Crates of stones and scrap metal lined the fence line, ready to be hurled down on any fool who tried to push through. Lanterns flickered behind overturned carts, throwing shifting shadows on faces drawn tight with worry and grit. Marigold worked alongside them, hauling boards with Larkin, tying ropes around fence posts until her hands bled. When the baby kicked at her ribs, she pressed a hand to her belly, whispering promises she could not afford to break. "Not yet, little one, not yet." At twilight, they gathered around the cookfire. Salt pork and beans simmered in a blackened pot, the smell too thin to fill the empty space in their bellies. They ate in silence, eyes flicking to the tree line where the prairie's edge turned to black. The prairie shadow stood apart, polishing his coat beneath the flicker of the lantern. His eyes never strayed from the ridge. Marigold moved to him, bowl in hand. "You should eat," she said. "I've been fed all I need." She sat on an overturned crate beside him, the warmth of the fire soaking into her bones. "Wade's men, they'll come tonight?" He didn't look at her. "They'll come when they think we're weakest. Before dawn, most likely. Men like Wade hate the dark, but they hate dying more." She traced the rim of her bowl with a fingertip, then set it aside untouched. The fire crackled. In its glow, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the new scars hidden in the hollows of his cheeks. He had once been a ghost story whispered by drunkards. Now he was flesh and blood again, tired, mortal, but more dangerous than any legend they'd ever told. "Do you regret it?" she asked, coming back. He met her eyes for the first time since dusk. Every man regrets what he's good at. He holstered the Colt. "But sometimes you pick up your old tools because the job demands it." She opened her mouth to speak but was cut short by the distant report of hooves on dry earth, faint but unmistakable, like rain on a grave. A single shout rang out from the far barricade. Then another. Marigold shot to her feet. Her wound tugged at her side, but she ignored it. The shadow touched her elbow, steadying her. "Remember what I taught you. Pick your shots. Trust your aim." She drew in a breath, letting the fear settle. "Like dust on an empty floor. And you?" He smiled, a crack of moonlight in a storm. "I'll remind them what happens when you corner a ghost." The air grew electric as the hooves multiplied, thunder rolling across the dark prairie. Shadows flickered between the orchard rows, the barricades, the skeletal corral. Wade Hawkins had come, and with him, the reckoning they had all feared. Marigold turned, lifting her rifle. The fire's glow caught the badge at her breast, glinting like a star refusing to die. In that breathless moment, as the townsfolk readied their weapons, and the shadow vanished into the orchard's dark embrace, Marigold felt the child within her shift once more. a reminder that dawn always follows the longest night. The first shot split the night like a branch cracking in a gale. Marigold ducked behind an overturned wagon, breath ragged as bullets hissed overhead. The orchard beyond the barricades shuddered with the thunder of hoofbeats and the bark of Wade Hawkins's riders, their silhouettes weaving between the skeletal apple trees like phantoms conjured from her darkest dreams. She pressed her cheek to the stock of her rifle, the wood warm and worn beneath her palm. Around her, the men from Whisper Valley fired in uneven bursts, the snap of old revolvers, the cough of rusty shotguns. Sparks spat into the cold darkness, illuminating the fence line they'd built with blood and sweat just hours ago. Hold. The line, Walt Jenkins bellowed beside her. The old man's voice, hoarse with age and whiskey, rose like a preacher's cry at the gates of hell. He fired both barrels of his scattergun into the orchard, the recoil nearly toppling him. A rider screamed and tumbled from his saddle, crashing through a row of brittle trees. For a moment, silence fell, that awful, tight silence that lives between the beats of a dying heart. Then the orchard exploded with shouting. More riders surged forward, their horses churning the dry earth into black smoke. Marigold's pulse hammered in her ears. She counted 2, 3, 5 shadows flanking the far trench. She sighted on the lead man, an outlaw with a bandana over his face and wild eyes, shining beneath his hat brim. She tracked his shoulder, felt the baby shift. Inside her, as if to anchor her hand. Breathe out. She squeezed the trigger. The shot snapped across the field. The rider's head whipped back, hat sailing into the night, body tumbling under the hooves of his own horse. Beside her, young Tom Greeley whooped, firing blindly over the barricade. They're falling back, but Marigold knew better. She scanned the orchard's edge, breath freezing in her lungs as a deeper shadow detached itself from the trees. Wade Hawkins. He sat astride a dark mare, the moonlight catching the silver concos on his coat and the cruel line of his mouth. He didn't shout or gesture. He just lifted one gloved hand, a silent signal. Behind him, more shapes emerged. Dozens, men on foot, rifles gleaming, axes and pistols glinting like sharks' teeth. They moved with the patience of men who had killed enough to savor the moment. Before the slaughter, Marigold ducked as a bullet splintered the wagon's wheel. Chips of wood stung her cheek. She pivoted, sighted again, fired. Another rider fell, his scream swallowed by the orchard's rustling branches. A hand landed on her shoulder. She spun, eyes wide, but it was Larkin, face slick with sweat, and blood from a graze along his hairline. They're pushing the west barricade, he gasped. We can't hold both sides. Marigold's mind raced. The west barricade was thin, just a line of crates and a scatter of old fence posts. If it fell, Wade's men would pour through like a flood. Walt! She barked. The old man lurched to her side. Take Tom. Reinforce the west. Use the dynamite if they push too close. Walt spat a curse. Ain't gonna have a barn left when this is done. Better a barn in splinters than a grave. She snapped. He clapped her on the shoulder and stumbled off, hauling Tom in his wake. Marigold turned back to the orchard. Wade was gone, vanished into the dark like smoke. Her eyes darted between the trees, searching for any sign of the prairie shadow. A rifle cracked deep in the orchard, a single, precise shot that made her breath hitch. Then another, a cry, another shot. Like a heartbeat echoing back from the grave, he was out there. Alone, hunting Wade's men like a wolf among sheep. She dropped behind the barricade, heart rattling her ribs. A boy not much older than 16 knelt beside her, clutching a rifle so old its barrel shone like an heirloom. Miss Sinclair, Marigold, what if he don't come back? The boy whispered. She locked eyes with him, and in her voice she poured every scrap of faith, every ragged ounce of defiance. Then we stand anyway. This land is ours. This town is ours. We hold until we can't hold anymore. A shot cracked. From the ridge, the prairie shadows work. Marigold imagined him there, coat ghosting behind him as he moved between the trees. A ghost with a heartbeat, she thought. A ghost who chose to come back. Another volley slammed into the barricade. Bullets punched holes in the crates, spat dirt into their hair. The boy flinched but stayed kneeling. Marigold reached over, laying her hand on his arm. "Steady," she murmured. "Wait for your moment." The boy nodded. His breath came slow, measured. He lifted his rifle, sighting through the shattered gaps in the barricade. The orchard erupted. Riders broke from the trees, charging again, shouting and firing. Marigold's pulse surged. She rose to one knee, sighted along her rifle. Crack! The boy's shot rang out first, dropping a bandit who'd nearly cleared the trench. Crack! Marigold's bullet snapped through another's leg, sending him screaming. Under his horse's hooves, the barricade shook as two more outlaws slammed against it, knives flashing. The boy lost his footing, backpedaling as a rider swung a hatchet down, but Marigold swung her rifle like a club, cracking the man's skull with a sickening crunch. She stumbled, stars swimming in her vision. The rider collapsed at her feet. She dropped her rifle, fumbling for the revolver at her hip. The boy scrambled up, panting. "More coming! We can't hold!" Marigold braced herself against the barricade, revolver clutched in blood-slick fingers. "Yes, we can," she rasped. A roar rose from the far ridge. Through the chaos, she saw him, the prairie shadow, coat shredded, hat gone, rifle smoking as he strode into the orchard's edge like a ghost stepped out of an old war story. "Push them back," he bellowed, voice deep as thunder. "Make them bleed." A dozen townsmen rose behind him, firing into the orchard with newfound fury. Riders wheeled in panic as the shadow cut through them, his revolver barking, each shot precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Marigold felt the fear in her chest crack open, replaced by something fierce. Wild, unstoppable. She lifted her revolver. High, her voice carrying over the orchard's roar. "For the valley!" And as the line surged forward, the orchard erupted in a storm of gunfire, the final stand for a land they would not surrender. The first blush of dawn cast the Sinclair homestead in shades of pale fire, revealing the battlefield for what it was: churned earth, splintered barricades, and the ghosts of men who'd come here thinking fear would be enough to win them. The land. Marigold braced herself against the cracked fence post near the orchard's edge, the revolver heavy in her hand. Her breath came shallow, each inhale stirring the raw ache in her ribs where a bullet had grazed her. The baby shifted. Within her, as if to remind her, she was still here, still fighting. Smoke drifted in ragged ribbons across the orchard rows. From somewhere beyond the broken fence, a single gunshot echoed, then silence. The prairie shadow emerged from the drifting haze like something born from the land itself, coat torn nearly to rags, hat lost to the dark hours before. His revolver dangled from his fingers, muzzle still smoking. Blood streaked his forearm, but his eyes burned clear and sharp. Marigold sagged with relief, though the pain in her side flared like a match head. "How many?" she rasped. He shook his head, scanning the tree line. Not enough. Wade's still out there. Behind them, the townsmen clustered along the barricades, their faces pale and lined with exhaustion. Walt Jenkins leaned against an upturned wagon wheel, reloading his shotgun with trembling hands. Larkin wiped sweat and blood from his brow, glancing at the battered orchard as if expecting the trees themselves to rise and strike. The shadow stepped to her, voice low. "This is where he'll come. Wade never leaves the last bullet to someone else." Marigold tasted the iron tang of fear in her mouth. "He'll come for me." "Yes," the shadow said. "And that's how we end it." Marigold sank onto the fence rail, the revolver slipping from her grasp. The shadow caught it before it hit the dirt, checking the cylinder with practiced calm. The first blush of dawn cast the Sinclair homestead in shades of pale fire, revealing the battlefield for what it was: churned earth, splintered barricades, and the ghosts of men who'd come here thinking fear would be enough to win them. The land. Marigold braced herself against the cracked fence post near the orchard's edge, the revolver heavy in her hand. Her breath came shallow, each inhale stirring the raw ache in her ribs where a bullet had grazed her. The baby shifted. Within her, as if to remind her, she was still here, still fighting. Smoke drifted in ragged ribbons across the orchard rows. From somewhere beyond the broken fence, a single gunshot echoed, then silence. The prairie shadow emerged from the drifting haze like something born from the land. Itself, coat torn nearly to rags, hat lost to the dark hours before. His revolver dangled from his fingers, muzzle still smoking. Blood streaked his forearm, but his eyes burned clear and sharp. Marigold sagged with relief, though the pain in her side flared like a match head. "How many?" she rasped. He shook his head, scanning the tree line. Not enough. Wade's still out there. Behind them, the townsmen clustered along the barricades, their faces pale and lined with exhaustion. Walt Jenkins leaned against an upturned wagon wheel, reloading his shotgun with trembling hands. Larkin wiped sweat and blood from his brow, glancing at the battered orchard as if expecting the trees themselves to rise and strike. The shadow stepped to her, voice low. "This is where he'll come. Wade never leaves the last bullet to someone else." Marigold tasted the iron tang of fear in her mouth. "He'll come for me." "Yes," the shadow said. "And that's how we end it." Marigold sank onto the fence rail, the revolver slipping from her grasp. The shadow caught it before it hit the dirt, checking the cylinder with practiced calm. "I've only got 2 shots left," she said, voice flat. His lips twitched, not a smile, but something close to it. "Two's enough." A rustle in the brush stilled them both. Then a shape appeared at the far orchard row, a figure on foot, coat flapping, rifle slung low. Wade Hawkins. He moved with the deliberate calm of a man who'd survived too many shootouts to fear the last one. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but Marigold saw the twist of his mouth, that cold curl of a man who'd waited for this moment since Redmond failed him. "Sinclair." Wade called, voice cutting through the hush like a blade. "Come out. Let's end this like folks instead of dogs." Marigold's pulse hammered. The shadow's hand closed around hers, steady as the dawn. "Stay here," he murmured. She bristled. "No." Their eyes locked, hers blazing with defiance, his calm as the prairie sky. "He wants you rattled. Let him have me instead." She drew a breath that tasted like gun oil and ash. "We do this together." A silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the windmill turning behind the orchard. Finally, the shadow gave the faintest nod. "Together, then." Wade stepped closer, boots crunching on scorched grass. His rifle dangled loose, like he barely needed it. His eyes flicked from the shadow to Marigold, taking her in, measuring her up like a prize bull at market. "Thought you'd be halfway to Carson City by now," Wade sneered. "You've got nothing left but a shack and a graveyard." Marigold lifted her chin, voice low but steady. "It's mine." "And that's enough," Wade laughed, the sound hollow in the orchard's ruin. "Shadow, you should have stayed dead. This ain't your fight." The shadow stepped forward, coat brushing Marigold's hip as he moved in front of her. His revolver rose, steady despite the tremor that danced at the edge of his fatigue. "I made it my fight when you crossed her fence line." Wade's eyes narrowed. He shifted his weight, just a hair, but the shadow saw it, felt it in the tightness of Wade's grip, the twitch of his left boot. The windmill creaked again, a single mournful note that felt like a heartbeat. A single shot rang out. Marigold flinched. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last chill of night and revealing the orchard for what it truly was, a graveyard of fresh scars and old roots. Marigold leaned against the splintered fence rail, her revolver finely holstered, her legs shaking beneath her dress. She could feel the baby moving, a flutter that brought her back from the edge of every grim thought. Larkin stepped up, dirt caked into the lines on his forehead. He carried a battered tin cup of water, hands trembling. As he passed it to her, "Townsfolk are checking the fence line," he said. "We found 2 more stragglers trying to crawl away. Walt's got them tied up at the barn." Marigold took a sip, warm, stale, but it cut through the dust in her throat. "How many did we lose?" she asked. Larkin swallowed. "Not as many as I feared. A few dead. Some hurt bad. The doc's patching 'em up in your kitchen." She nodded, her eyes drifting toward the orchard's shadowy rows. She half expected to see the prairie shadow standing there like some ancient spirit, but when her eyes found him, he was not in the orchard. He was kneeling near the old corral, sleeves rolled up, helping young Tom Greeley bind a broken gate. No ghost, just a man, she thought, flesh and bone. Tired, scarred, but still standing. She pressed the tin star, still pinned to her chest, flat against her heart. "Tell Walt to keep watch on those 2. If they so much as spit wrong, tie 'em tighter." "Already done," Larkin said, with a half-smile that looked strange on his gaunt face. Marigold pushed herself upright, ignoring the fire in her side. The orchard whispered in the breeze, the only sound besides the distant hammering of fence posts and the muttered voices of the survivors. She crossed the churned yard toward the prairie shadow. He looked up at her approach, eyes bleary but clear. "You should be resting," he said. She snorted. "That's your line." His mouth twitched at that. He tied off the rope, testing the knot with one sharp tug. "Barn'll hold. The corral, too, for now." She let her gaze drift across the land, the scorched fence line, the battered barricades, the scattered bodies already covered with old blankets. The promise of what she'd fought for lay beneath it all, soil that could still yield crops, a roof that still stood, a cradle waiting inside. "What happens next?" she asked. Not because she didn't know, but because she needed to hear him say it. The prairie shadow rose, dust puffing off his coat. He moved stiffly, every inch of him announcing the price of the night they'd survived. He gestured at the fence line, the orchard, the barn. "Next, you rebuild. Put your walls back up, dig deeper roots. This place will remember you did that." She studied him, the way he held his right shoulder a fraction lower, how his gaze kept darting to the tree line as if expecting more riders to burst through. He was still fighting ghosts, she realized, ones that would never come for her, but would always come for him. "And you?" she asked. He shrugged. "Never been much for staying put." A pause stretched between them, full of things unsaid. She reached out, fingers brushing the frayed edge of his sleeve. "You could." His eyes softened at that. "Not this time. There'll be more like Wade. Folks who think a badge and a woman alone make easy pickings. This valley's got more to lose now. They'll need to stand without a ghost watching over their shoulder." She felt the truth of it settle like the last nail driven into a fresh fence rail. She drew in a breath, letting it settle in her ribs alongside the pain, and the baby's shift in weight. "You'll always have a place here," she said. He gave the smallest nod. "And you'll always have that." He gestured to the star on her chest. She looked down at it, dull but solid, warm from her own blood and breath. A promise that she could hold the line, with or without him. The morning wind rose, lifting her hair from her shoulders. In its hush, she heard the orchard's soft rustle, the earth remembering every bullet, every footstep, every name whispered in the dark. When she looked up, he was already walking away, past the barn, past the fence. Line that had cost so much to defend. He didn't look back. Legends rarely did. Marigold touched her belly, the tiny life within kicking against her palm. "You're going to grow up here," she murmured, "on land no man will ever take again." Behind her, the people of Whisper Valley moved like ants. On a wounded giant, fixing fence posts, burying the dead, patching the orchard's wounds. They did it because she'd shown them how to stand. Because one man had reminded them that ghosts are just men, and courage is just a choice you make when the dark comes to call. She turned to the orchard, voice low. "I'll keep watch now." And as the sun broke fully over the battered valley, Marigold Sinclair, no longer just a widow, but something far fiercer, breathed in the dawn and started again. End of part 11. The weeks that followed dawned hard and bright. Summer heat baked the soil, sealing away the scars of churned earth and dried blood beneath a fresh crust of dust. The orchard stood battered but alive, limbs heavy with unripe fruit, branches stitched. Back with twine and rough boards where bullets had chewed through bark, Marigold rose every day before the roosters crow. She checked the fences, walked the lines the prairie shadow had marked in the dirt that last dawn. She'd catch herself half expecting his silhouette there at the tree line, coat flapping, hat tugged low, but the orchard remained empty, save for the wind and the work she carried on alone. The townsfolk kept their promises. Walt Jenkins brought a wagon full of scrap lumber and old nails from his barn, limping through the gate each Sunday with a grin and a battered flask hidden in his coat. Larkin stayed on, sleeping in the loft above the stable, hammering fresh boards into the fence line by day and keeping watch over the fields by night. Even the deputy, that soft-bellied man who once called her a fool, made his rounds with a rifle across his lap, tipping his hat when he passed her gate. She could see it in their eyes when they looked at her now. Not pity, not gossip, not suspicion, respect, flinty and quiet. She felt it most on the day she stood near the orchard's edge, where the ground still held the black stains of Wade Hawkins and his men. There, she could almost taste what they had given her, a land that could no longer be taken, a story too real to be twisted into gossip. In the evenings, she sat by the cradle Henry had built. Her fingers traced the wood's smooth curve, the whorls of old knots he'd sanded down with care. Sometimes she'd feel the baby stir, little feet drumming against the inside of her ribs like a message tapped out from the other side of tomorrow. Almost. "Time," she'd whisper, "almost." She wrote letters she never sent, to her parents back east, to Henry's brother in Carson City, even to the Prairie Shadow, though she never knew where to address them. She wrote about the fences she'd mended, the orchard that still bore fruit, the way the nights fell soft and silent now, broken only by the windmill's slow creak. Some nights she walked the orchard rows by lamplight, rifle across her back. She'd pause by the old fence line, listening for hoofbeats in the dark. But all she heard was the hush of branches rubbing together, whispering secrets she'd learned to trust. You fought. You held. This is yours. When the baby came, it was Larkin who found her doubled over by the garden gate, her hands braced against the rough cedar rail Henry had once leaned on to kiss her goodbye. He half carried, half dragged her inside, barked at Walt to fetch the doctor, shooed the fretting womenfolk who tried to crowd her bed. The storm outside rose as she labored, wind battering the shutters, rain hammering the roof. She felt the house itself brace against the squall, the walls groaning but holding fast, just as she had. When it was done, and the child lay wrapped in her arms, Marigold wept. Not from pain, not from fear, but from the raw, breathtaking relief that tomorrow still existed, and that it now drew breath beside her. Larkin hovered in the doorway, hat in his hands, eyes wide and soft as a boy's. "Strong one," he said, voice cracking, like her mother. Marigold cradled the tiny bundle against her chest. The baby's eyes fluttered open, slate gray, the color of a storm bank on the horizon. In that moment, the orchard's ghosts faded. Wade Hawkins, Redmond, the Prairie Shadow's long trail of dead men. They drifted back into the dirt where they belonged. What remained was here in her arms, warm and alive, A promise that the valley would outlast every bullet and every outlaw who thought it could be tamed. She rocked the child slowly, her thumb brushing the downy hair at her brow. "Welcome home," she murmured. "This land is yours now." Outside, dawn broke clean and gold across the battered fence lines. The windmill turned, its old creak now a lullaby instead of a warning. Fields shimmered under the rain's soft hush, each drop carrying away the last traces of gunpowder and blood. Whisper Valley would tell this story for years to come, about the widow who stood alone until she didn't have to. About the ghost who came back to remind them that courage is never just legend. And about the orchard that grew again because someone decided it was worth fighting for. Marigold leaned her head back, the baby's heartbeat pressed to her chest. She breathed in the smell of rain on wood, of soil turned sweet again, and the hush of a cradle rocking slow in the morning light. Somewhere, far beyond the ridge, the prairie held its breath for what would come next. But here in this battered homestead, this orchard that had tasted fire and fear and hope, a new story began, seated in the dark and reaching always, always, for the dawn. End of part 12. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The first frost kissed the orchard, laying a thin sheen of white across the battered fence posts and the mended gates. Marigold rose before dawn as always, the baby bundled against her chest in a worn blanket Henry's mother had quilted long ago. She moved through the mist like a ghost, yet she was more alive than she'd ever been. The prairie shadow had ridden out 3 days prior, a quiet word at her door, a promise that he'd circle the trails near Devil's Basin to be sure. Wade's stragglers had truly scattered. He left behind only a single word. Soon, the town had begun to heal too. Walt Jenkins had taken up work at the church, helping patch the roof before the real snow came. Larkin and the young men who'd once doubted her now patrolled the trails. Without waiting for her word, Whisper Valley, it turned out, had learned to stand. Marigold pushed open the barn doors, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the warmth of the animals greeted her. The old mule brayed, chickens rustled in there. Pens and the mare that had carried her through the last battle nickered softly. She stroked the horse's nose, whispering words that belonged to no one but them. Outside, the windmill creaked in its slow circle, a lullaby to the baby dozing at her breast. Marigold hummed under her breath, the tune echoing off the rafters. There were fences yet to fix, saplings yet to prune, but for the first time in years, the work felt like a promise, not a burden. She carried the baby back to the cabin and laid her in the cradle Henry had built. The child's breath came in soft sighs, tiny fingers curling against the hand-stitched blanket. Marigold sat beside the crib, one hand resting on her belly where life had once kicked like thunder. Now that thunder was a heartbeat wrapped in flannel and dreams. A knock at the door startled her from the quiet. She rose, hand instinctively brushing the revolver on the shelf, a habit she hadn't yet unlearned, that it was Larkin. Hat in hand, eyes wide with the weight of something unsaid. "Riders at the pass," he said, "could be traitors. Could be the last of Wade's boys." Marigold didn't flinch. "Get Walt. Tell the boys to watch the ridge but keep hidden. No shooting unless they cross the creek." Larkin nodded, relief flickering across his face. "They'll listen to you, always do." She almost laughed. How strange to be trusted. Now when once she'd begged for help and been met with closed doors and polite lies. She stepped out onto the porch, her breath turning to steam in the dawn. The orchard lay quiet beyond the yard, trees bowed under the frost. She could still see ghosts there, Redmond, Wade, the prairie shadow standing watch. But now they felt like shadows of a bad dream, unable to touch her. She heard the baby stir behind her, a soft whimper rising in the warmth of the cabin. She turned, letting her hand fall from the revolver. The storm had passed. The fence would hold. And if it didn't, she'd hold it herself. She went back inside, closing the door on the frost and the distant hooves that might bring trouble or trade. She knelt beside the cradle, her fingers brushing her child's downy hair. "Whatever. Comies," she whispered, "this land stays yours." And outside, the wind carried her promise through the orchard, along the fence line, across the valley she had claimed not with fear, but with the fiercest love a mother could carry. End of Part 14. Winter settled into Whisper Valley with a bite sharper than any outlaw's blade. Snow blanketed the orchard rows, muffling the windmill's steady creak. The creek froze in places, its thin sheet of ice cracking like a whisper under the weight of passing deer. Marigold stood at her kitchen window, a cup of steaming tea cradled in her hands. She watched the snow fall, soft as ash, and let her mind drift back to that terrible night. Barricades splintering, the orchard blooming with gunfire, the prairie shadow moving through the darkness like a rumor brought to life. Now the orchard slept under the snow. No hoofbeats disturbed the hush. The townsfolk who once crossed the street to avoid her now knocked on her door with gifts: fresh bread, a new quilt for the baby, a jar of pickled beets. Each offering felt like a fence post driven deeper into the ground, proof that this land, this life, held fast. The baby cooed from her cradle by the hearth. Marigold turned, watching the tiny fingers curl and uncurl. There was strength there, born from hardship. She wondered if her child would remember the orchard scars, the stories whispered on cold nights about the widow who stood when no one else would. A knock came at the door, gentle, respectful. Marigold's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "Come in." It was Larkin, cheeks red from the wind, scarf draped over his battered coat. He stamped snow from his boots, glancing at the baby with a sheepish grin. "Got word from the ridge. Riders passed through at dawn. Just drifters. No colors, no questions asked. They didn't linger." Marigold nodded. "Good. Long as they ride past." He hesitated, eyes drifting to the cradle. "Town wants to hold a meeting come spring. Talk about the fence lines, maybe hiring a reel." "Sheriff, they want you there." She raised an eyebrow. "Me?" "You're the reason we've got a town left to protect," he said simply. "They trust you." Trust, the word settled in her chest like a coal pressed into snow. A warmth she hadn't expected, yet refused to let melt away. "I'll come," she said. "But they better not think I'll run it all for them." Larkin laughed, tugging at the brim of his hat. "They'd never dare." When he left, the hush of snowfall crept back into the cabin. Marigold crossed to the cradle, lifting her baby into her arms. She pressed her lips to the downy hair, breathing in the scent of milk and firewood. The wind rattled the window panes, but it couldn't shake her. Not anymore. There would always be another storm, another man like Wade Hawkins, waiting on the horizon. But this time the valley would stand with her. Because they remembered. Outside, the orchard's branches bent under the snow's weight, but did not break. Somewhere in the distance, the prairie shadow rode his lonely trails, chasing rumors and memories. She hoped, wherever he was, he knew. The land he'd defended still held. She whispered to her child, "You'll grow strong here, stronger than any storm." And in that quiet kitchen, warmed by the fire and the heartbeat pressed close to hers, Marigold Sinclair held her child and the valley's promise that some things once fought for never fall again. End of Part 15. The snow came heavier as January deepened, muffling the world until the orchard seemed carved from silence. Each morning, Marigold bundled her child against her chest and walked the fence line. With every step, the boots that had once stumbled, under the weight of fear, now pressed tracks that marked a different truth. The valley was hers to keep. Word had spread far past Whisper Valley. Ranch hands from Cedar Ridge drifted in to barter labor for shelter when their winter stores ran thin. Old enemies brought word of scattered outlaws who'd once sworn loyalty to Wade Hawkins, but now huddled like strays, starving and leaderless. Some asked for amnesty, work, a patch of land to plant come spring. Marigold gave it, cautiously, but she gave it. She'd learned what her father never had. That land without people willing to fight for, it was just dirt waiting to be claimed by the next man with a gun. So she let the drifters mend fences, haul logs, patch the barn roof. She watched them. Like a hawk. A gun still hung behind the cabin door, but she didn't have to reach for it as often as she once did. One morning she found young Tom Greeley and Larkin near the creek, chopping ice so the livestock could drink. She paused by the bank, the baby gurgling in her arms, and listened to their laughter echo through the bare trees. "You two work better than you did when I paid you in whiskey and beans," she called. Tom straightened, sweat steaming from his collar. "We figured out what we're standing for now, Miss Sinclair. Makes the work lighter." Larkin shot her a grin, pushing damp hair from his brow. "Fence'll hold through any storm." "Mark my words," Marigold smiled, though her eyes drifted to the horizon. Storms came in all shapes. She knew that better than most. Back at the cabin, she stirred the hearth's coals, the baby dozing nearby in her cradle. The wind outside rattled the shutters, but the roof held. Her thoughts wandered to the prairie shadow. Weeks had passed since she'd last seen him. Yet every dawn she half expected his knock, a voice low and steady, reporting, that the last of Wade's pack had vanished into the hills. Sometimes, at night, she dreamed of him, walking the orchard's rows beneath a blood moon, coat fluttering like the ghost he'd once been to her. But each morning she woke to the smell of wood smoke and milk and her child's breath, and she let the past drift back into the orchard's shadows where it belonged. One evening, a rider appeared through the snow, dismounting by the porch. Marigold stepped out, rifle resting across her forearm. But when the stranger pulled back his scarf, she saw the deep-set eyes, the hair gone silver at the temples. "Doc Green," she breathed. The old doctor smiled through cracked lips. "Hard ride from Cedar Ridge. Thought I'd check on you and the little one." She ushered him in, setting tea to boil. They sat by the hearth as the baby slept, the crackle of the fire stitching their silence together. "Bob McAllister asked about you," Doc Green said at last. "Sends word when he can. Says the territory's quieter than it's been in years." She felt something in her chest ease. "And the shadow?" Doc's eyes softened. "Ghosts don't leave messages, Marigold. But you know better than anyone. He's where he needs to be." She glanced at the badge still resting on the mantel, the tin star that had marked the beginning and of so much blood and resolve. She didn't reach for it now. She didn't have to. Doc leaned forward, resting a hand on her arm. "You're the story they tell now, the one they'll tell their children." Marigold looked to the cradle, to the orchard beyond the window where the snow fell like quiet forgiveness. She thought of Henry's hands building the fences, of the baby's soft sighs in the dark, of the prairie shadow riding between ghosts and dawn. "They'll have better stories to tell," she said softly. "Better than mine." Doc Green lifted his cup in a toast only they could understand. "You're wrong, Marigold Sinclair. Some stories are worth the telling again and again." Outside, the wind howled through the orchard's bare branches. But inside, the hearth glowed steady, the cradle, the mother, the valley all holding fast. End of part 16. Winter's grip tightened around Whisper Valley, but inside Marigold's cabin, life warmed the cold from the walls. By February, snowdrifts leaned high against the orchard fence, wind rattling the shutters with a low, restless moan. Yet each morning she lit the hearth, bundled her child tight, and walked the rows where Wade Hawkins's men had once crept like wolves. Now there were only rabbit tracks, the hush of birds perched among the apple boughs waiting for spring, inside. She mended what needed mending. Blankets, a broken cradle rail, her own heart, though that stitching took the longest. Nights found her rocking by the fire, the baby's head pressed to her collarbone, the old tin star catching light on the mantle. Each flicker reminded her, the fight had come and she'd met it. The fight would come again, and she'd meet that too. The townsfolk sent word by sled. Walt Jenkins, stooped and grinning through his rheumatism, brought smoked meat wrapped in oilcloth. Larkin left fresh-cut wood by her porch. No payment asked, no thanks needed. They didn't treat her like a widow anymore. They treated her like a keeper of something none of them could name. But all of them trusted Dot on the coldest night of the season. When the frost painted the windows in spiderweb patterns, she dreamed of the prairie shadow. He came in through the orchard gate, his boots silent in the snow, his coat draped across his shoulders like a shroud. He did not speak, but when he stepped close, she saw no gun at his hip. Just empty hands, palms turned up, as if to show her that what needed killing was already buried. Dot. She woke with a start, the baby stirring in her arms. A log cracked in the hearth, sparks tumbling up the chimney like stars fleeing the dark. When dawn came, she strapped her child against her back and walked to the barn. She found Larkin tending the mare, humming some half-remembered tune from his childhood. "Roads'll open soon," he said, nodding toward the drifts that had begun to slump under the weak sun. "Folks are talking about a spring market in town. New traders, new faces." Marigold paused, running a hand along the horse's warm flank. "New trouble too, maybe." Larkin's grin flashed. "That's what the fences are for." He said it like a joke, but she heard the truth beneath it. The fences were more than boards and nails now. They were the boundary between the woman she'd once been and the woman she'd fought to become. They were the line that said, "Here we stand." She walked back to the orchard fence after Larkin left, the baby tucked quiet against her shoulder. She ran gloved fingers along the wood. Beneath the frost she could feel the grain, the knots her father's hammer had driven, the splinters Henry's hands had sanded smooth. Dot in the hush. She could almost hear footsteps beyond the orchard. Not Wade Hawkins or Redmond or any man who thought they could break this land, but the prairie shadow, pacing the rows like a sentinel made from old regrets and older promises. She didn't need him now. That was the gift he'd left her, not the gun, not the badge, but the knowing that she could stand long after the legend rode off. She shifted the baby on her hip and looked out at the drifting snow, the orchard asleep under its white blanket. "We're ready," she whispered. "When the thaw comes, we'll plant again." She turned for the cabin, boots crunching through the crust. Behind her, the wind wound through the apple trees like a lullaby. Ahead of her, the cradle waited, and beyond that, a valley that had learned that the fiercest walls are not the ones built of timber and iron, but the ones forged in the heart when there's no one left to stand but you. End of part 17. The thaw came in fits and starts, the sun teasing the earth by day, the frost reclaiming it by night. Marigold felt it first in the orchard where the ice retreated from the roots, leaving behind damp soil ready to breathe again. The windmill creaked more easily, its blades freed of the rime that had weighed them down all winter. Dot. She worked alongside Larkin and the other ranch hands who'd stayed on. Fences that had splintered under snowdrifts were pulled straight, posts tamped deeper into the warming earth. Saplings, bruised by the freeze, were pruned and braced for new growth. The orchard smelled of damp wood and promise, the smell of another chance. On the ridge, rumors came down with the meltwater. A drifter who'd once ridden for Wade Hawkins, seen near Cedar Ridge, half frozen and asking after Marigold's land. She heard it all, weighing each word like a bullet before setting it aside. She didn't fear shadows that came on horseback anymore. She rose before dawn each day, the baby strapped snug to her chest. They would walk the fence line, passing the place where the orchard had nearly fallen, the ground still scarred where the old barricades had once stood. She would whisper to her child as they went, "Here we stood. Here we stand." The town began to wake with the spring, too. Walt Jenkins dragged his old bones to every corner of Whisper Valley, rattling on about plans for a new church bell. Larkin spoke of extending the patrols. Fewer men needed now, but no less vigilance. They had learned too well what came when. You looked away for too long. One morning, she found a package left on her porch, a small bundle wrapped in oilskin, tied with rawhide. She opened it to find a single tin star, polished bright as a mirror, and a note in a hand she knew. Keep it close. Shadow, her breath caught. The badge glinted in the sunrise. She wondered where he was, what wind-whipped trail had claimed him this time, but she did not pin the star to her breast. She set it inside the cradle beside her baby's soft blanket. It was a promise for tomorrow, not today. That night, the wind rose again, carrying the orchard's secrets through the window where she sat by the hearth. The baby stirred in her arms, eyes open and calm as an old soul's. "You'll know what this means," she murmured to the child, fingertips brushing the star. "When the time comes, you'll stand too." A knock sounded on the door, gentle, almost shy. She found Larkin waiting, boots muddy from the thaw, a nervous grin hidden under his unshaven face. "Meeting in the town hall," he said. "Waltz. Pushing for a new schoolhouse. Says we got more young ones now. Says we ought to build it right, where the orchard can watch over M." Marigold raised her eyebrows. "The orchard?" Larkin shuffled his boots. "Folks say it's like a reminder of what we are when we stand together, and who taught us how." She felt laughter bubble up, sharp, warm, unstoppable. The baby squirmed against her, a tiny giggle echoing her own. Marigold reached for her shawl, pulling it tight around both their shoulders. "I'll come," she said, voice steady as iron. "But they'd best be ready. There's work to do." She stepped out onto the porch, feeling the thawing earth beneath her boots. The orchard stretched before her, battered, rooted, waiting for her hands to shape it yet again. And overhead, the wind carried a secret promise through the branches, a whisper of ghosts and legends long since buried. "This land holds because we hold it. And we always will." End of part 18. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it burst through Whisper Valley like a dam giving way. Marigold rose to find the orchard in bloom, delicate white blossoms trembling in the breeze, the branches humming with bees that stitched life back into every scarred bough. The creek ran fat and quick again, its banks humming with frogs and drifting petals. She carried her child on her hip now, stronger, heavier, wide-eyed at the world waking up around them. Together they walked the rows Henry had once planted, her boots squelching in the thaw-soft earth. Each tree felt like a vow kept, that the land would feed them, shelter them, stand with them. The town had found its feet too. The old meeting hall, once half-rotted and crooked, now shone with fresh paint and mended windows. They gathered there weekly, ranchers, trappers, and mothers with babies on their knees. They talked of schoolhouses and new roads, of harvests, and fences that would hold more than just cattle. They spoke of her too, though never when she was near enough to scold them for it. Walt Jenkins, bones cracking but voice clear as ever, tapped his cane on the meeting table one night. Sinclair held this valley when the worst of them rode through. No sheriff, no cavalry. Just her and that child and what was left of our backbone. No one argued. Some truth stood taller than any man who might challenge them. Outside the hall, Larkin caught up to her, his breath misting in the dusk. "Word is, that drifter you heard about, the one from Wade's old pack, he's holed up near Devil's Basin. Sheriff McAllister sent a rider. He wants you to know it's handled." Marigold bristled. "Handled?" Larkin chuckled, shaking his head. "They say the Shadow did it himself. Left a sign on the trail. Wade's men won't trouble you again." She felt something inside her tighten, not fear, but that old raw edge of memory. A man who'd once been a ghost stepping between her and the darkness one last time. "Good," she said, voice soft as a sigh. "Let him ride." When she got home that night, she found the orchard brushed silver in the moonlight. She stepped out onto the porch, her child pressed close to her heartbeat. She could almost see him there, coat flicking at his boots, hat brim low, eyes sharp under the stars. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind. It carried her words past the creek, the fence line, out to the ridge where ghosts kept watch. Later, the first fence post for the new schoolhouse was driven into the earth. She stood there, baby on her hip, her free hand guiding the hammer down with the others. When it cracked through the soft soil, a cheer rose from the gathered families. This was what the fight had been for. Not just the orchard. Not just her child. But for a place where roots would run deep enough that no drought, no outlaw, no winter storm could ever pull them free again. When she carried the baby home that evening, the blossoms fell like snow behind her, a trail of white petals marking the path of the woman who had learned that sometimes the fiercest walls are not the ones you build, but the ones you become. She stepped inside her cabin, the child fussing against her shoulder. She laid the baby down, brushed a petal from the tiny brow, and whispered a promise that only the orchard could hear. "This land will remember us, because we remember how to stand." Outside, the windmill turned slow in the dusk, a sentry against every shadow yet to come. End of Part 19. Summer rose slow and bright over Whisper Valley, burning away the last ghosts of frost from the orchard rows. Each morning, Marigold stepped outside with her child balanced on her hip, the blossoms now replaced by the swell of young fruit. Green apples crowding the boughs, branches weighted by promise. She'd spent the last weeks guiding the town's hands, mending tools, sharing what Henry had taught her, passing on the lessons carved into the orchard's bones. The new schoolhouse stood half-framed at the valley's edge, a skeleton of fresh timber waiting for walls that would shelter more than lessons. It would shelter the future. The baby squirmed against her shoulder, reaching for a leaf drifting in the wind. Marigold caught it, pressing the soft green against her child's tiny palm. Life, born from soil and sweat and blood. Word came on a warm evening. Wade Hawkins was dead. No rider from his old pack, no warning shots at the fence line. Just a lone drifter found him at the Devil's Basin, a figure in a battered coat, who spoke no word, fired only once, then vanished with the sun. Some swore it was the prairie shadow. Others said it was just the ghost she'd summoned when the orchard first learned how to stand. Marigold stood by the orchard fence that night, watching the moonlight turn the leaves to silver. She felt no triumph. Death was just an ending. What came after was what mattered. The land still needed tending. The fences still needed mending. And tomorrow always asked you to stand again. At the schoolhouse raising, they handed her the hammer first. She drove the last nail through the ridge beam, the thud of iron on wood echoing through the gathered crowd. The children watched, wide-eyed, as if to memorize how a woman could plant her feet in dirt that had once threatened to swallow her whole. When the work was done, she stayed behind. She sat on the new steps, the baby asleep in the crook of her arm, the orchard's hum drifting on the breeze. Walt Jenkins brought her a cup of tea, his gnarled hand trembling as he passed it over. "You'll always be the valley's beating heart." "Marigold," he said, voice cracked as old bark. She shook her head. "Not just me. It takes more than one pair of hands to hold the line." The old man chuckled. "Maybe, but it only takes one pair to remind the rest when to stand." When dusk fell, she carried her child home through the orchard rows, each step marked by memory, the barricades, the gunfire, the shadows who came and went. The trees whispered their secrets overhead, branches heavy with the weight of another harvest yet to come. She paused at the fence line, eyes drifting to the ridge. She didn't see him, not really, but in her heart she felt the shape of him, coat stirring in the wind, hand resting easy at his hip, watchful but finally at peace. "Rest now," she said softly. "We've got it from here." Inside the cabin, she laid her child down in the same cradle Henry had built all those seasons ago. The tin star lay tucked at the foot, polished clean by countless days of sun and countless nights of promise. Touched it once, not to wear it, but to remember what it meant. A fence is only as strong as the people willing to stand behind it. Outside, the windmill turned steady in the dark. The orchard's hum was a lullaby now, the story of a widow who fought for her land, a ghost who rode to remind her how, and a valley that would carry their memory in every root, every branch, every harvest yet to come. In the hush, she whispered. To the night, to her child, to the orchard that had become more than soil and trees. It had become home. We stand. And when we're gone, they will too. The wind carried that promise through the orchard, out to the ridge, across every fence post and cabin light that dared to flicker against the dark. And so, Whisper Valley held, a testament not to decay, guns that once defended it, but to the hands that still did. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.